Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Recovery Talk. Oh my god, there is this mosquito that is just buzzing around my mic, and I feel bad killing mosquitoes, so I'm just letting it buzz, but it's really going on my nerves. Oh my god, it's so annoying. Anyways, guys. Okay, it was actually a fruit fly, and I actually smacked it, and now I feel a little bit bad. But the show must go on, so yeah, let's get started. Today we are going to talk about the one and only unicorn syndrome. Yeah, you might have heard of that, or you might haven't. I actually made it up many years ago, and then a lot of people started using it, so I think I kind of coined the term, if you would say it that way. Yeah, I coined the term unicorn syndrome literally like 7, 8 years ago or something on Tumblr. And yeah, so that's the story of this word. It's not a real diagnosable syndrome. It is more a term used to describe a very specific set of behaviors and thought patterns that happen among people with eating disorders. And what is this, cognitive pattern, this behavioral pattern? Well, essentially, the unicorn syndrome is when someone with an eating disorder thinks that they are unicorns. They are completely different from everyone else in recovery, and that the basic rules of recovery of human biology applies to everyone but them. They are just uniquely different, uniquely flawed, uniquely insert word, right? It's just nothing applies to them, but it applies to everyone else, of course, just not to them, right? And that's also why it's called the unicorn syndrome, right? Because unicorns don't exist, right? Horses exist, right? And a lot of people in recovery think they are unicorns when actually they are just good old horses, right? That's not offensive to say because horses are wonderful. And of course, they're different horses as well, right? Not all horses are the same, but they're horses and not unicorns. Okay, so let's dig a bit more into the unicorn syndrome. How does it typically manifest? And also, why is it happening? Like, what is the function of the unicorn syndrome? And let's do the latter first, right? What is the function of the unicorn syndrome? Well, the function is very simple. It is a way to postpone or avoid recovery, right? That's just how it is. And I know this is something I say all the time, but the eating disorder will constantly try and make you postpone or avoid recovery. And the unicorn syndrome is a genius way for the eating disorder to do that by trying to convince you that, oh well, it doesn't apply to you, not the case for you, right? And I think that's helpful to know because when you know that that is kind of what is underlying, that it is a way to postpone or avoid recovery rather than something that is true, then it's also easier to tackle it, right? And I do want to say that, of course, it is completely normal and natural when you are entering something as scary as recovery to have doubts, to have fears, to be having these like what if thoughts. That is completely normal. But it can be also helpful to kind of give yourself a bit of a reality check and remind yourself that this could be the unicorn syndrome talking. And that if you find yourself constantly thinking that you are the exception to every rule and you are different from everyone else, then is that really in touch with reality though? Is it? And also, what evidence do you have to support that claim? This is a very interesting one because when I work, especially with clients who have the unicorn syndrome, whether lightly or very strongly, they will come with all sorts of very interesting, quote unquote, evidences as to why the unicorn syndrome applies to them. And I can relate so much. Oh my God, the amount of times I thought I had evidence as to why I'm different. Yeah. But this evidence is usually very weak. It would not hold up in court. I literally always tell my clients that, like, okay, I hear what you're saying, but would this hold up in court? So I'll give you an example. I had unicorn syndrome in every way imaginable, and one of them was that I had anorexia nervosa binge purge subtype, meaning I was binging and purging, and I love to binge and purge on sweet foods, right? And when I was a child, I always loved sweet foods. I loved it so much that my mom, when we had candy in the house, my mom would often have to hide it because I would just eat all the candy because I loved candy. And in my head, this meant, with the unicorn translator coming in, that I actually will not be able to recover from binging and purging because I clearly am addicted to sweet foods, and I was that before my eating disorder, and oh my god, I can never have sweet in the house, and this is why recovery is not for me. When actually the truth is that being really excited about sweets and wanting to eat sweets when you're a child is literally the most normal thing ever. Have you been around kids? Like, really? And when you hide it from them, when you hide something from a child, it becomes way more exciting. And also when you hide something from an adult as well, it becomes so much more exciting, right? When I talk about binging, I always talk about, the forbidden fruits taste the sweetest mentality. When you forbid yourself from something, it gets put on a pedestal and just becomes way more exciting, right? So this is, of course, what happened to me when I was a child, and I knew that I wasn't allowed to eat the candy except for on Saturdays, because in Norway we have a thing where candy is eaten only on Saturdays. I don't even know. Don't follow that now. Cultural thing, really. Anyone who is Norwegian will attest to that. It is a thing we have. Anyways, it just made it more exciting, right? And of course, this wasn't a sign that I couldn't recover from anorexia because I was doomed to binge and purge on sweet foods forever because I liked sweet foods as a child. But this was the evidence that my unicorn syndrome held up. Would that evidence hold up in court? Absolutely not. It's very weak evidence. And to use a different metaphor than the court metaphor, let's try and think of it as, writing an essay for university, writing an academic article. If I were to write an article and use that as evidence, I would have been failed. It would have been like, that doesn't really hold up. That is not, that's not valid. So anyways, that was just an example of how the unicorn syndrome worked in my case. But of course, it worked in so many other cases with me. I always thought that I was just, on one hand, I was like, oh yeah, I'm not sick enough. But on the other hand, I was like, yeah, I'm too sick to recover. I'm sicker than everyone else. I'm fundamentally flawed. Nobody is as, uniquely suffering as uniquely or intensely as me. But also, I'm not sick enough, right? How does that work? How does it work that you are not sick enough, but also you're too sick to recover, right? Yeah, interesting logic, huh? Very, very interesting logic. So what are some typical ways the unicorn syndrome manifests, right? I have used mine as an example, but that was, again, just one out of the many, many ways the unicorn syndrome manifested for me. But I'll talk about some very common ways for the unicorn syndrome to manifest that I see a lot, especially like in clients and also people that talk to with eating disorders. And I would say perhaps the most common one, except for the whole I cannot recover because I'm fundamentally flawed thing, is the unicorn syndrome when it comes to metabolic healing, weight gain, and, extreme hunger, binge purge cycles. I know that was a lot, so let's just take one by one here. And I know I have covered every single one of these, I think every single one of them in previous episodes. But I still want to talk a bit about it because with the unicorn syndrome, it does not matter how much I cover it. If you're deep in the unicorn syndrome, you're still not really going to think it applies to you. You would think it applies to other people. Very high chances that if you know someone who experiences exactly what you're going through, you will maybe even send them an episode about my podcast and say, oh yeah, this is explained here. But you won't think it applies to you. So let's take metabolism for an example. That's a very, very typical one. Eating disorders, as I've spoken about in the episode about metabolism, and eating disorder tends to make your metabolism quite suppressed, right? And it's very, very common in eating disorder recovery that in the earlier stages of recovery, you gain weight quite fast, eating not so much, right? It's literally what pretty much everyone in recovery experiences. Not everyone, but it's very, very common because you're working with the suppressed metabolism. And then people think, oh, well, the reason why I am gaining weight very fast, eating very little in recovery is because my metabolism is permanently broken. All of these other people are experiencing that their metabolism is temporarily suppressed, but in my case, it's permanently broken. Another example is extreme hunger, right? So you're in recovery, experiencing extreme hunger. Again, I've done a whole episode about extreme hunger with great detail. I speak about it all the time, down to the absolute like biology of it. And you will be in recovery, you experience an extreme hunger. And if someone else were to experience extreme hunger, you would know exactly what to explain it to, how to explain it to them, right? But when you're experiencing it, you're thinking, well, I'm different. In my case, it's actually not extreme hunger as a reaction to the restriction, right? In my case, it's me losing control, being greedy, getting used to binging out of habit. In my case, I will binge forever for the rest of my life. Therefore, recovery is not for me. In my case, it's not actually just a temporary thing of recovery, a temporary phase of extreme hunger. In my case, it's permanent. And with these two examples, right, so extreme hunger and also like rapid weight gain and slow metabolism, it's important to kind of highlight what would be the action in response to the unicorn syndrome here. Well, the ideal action would of course be to call it out as being the unicorn syndrome, which is also why I'm making this episode, to give you a term that you can use to call out your own behaviors. So that would be the good reaction, right? To just be like, oh yeah, I know I feel and think this way, but also, do I have evidence to support that claim? Maybe I should just, take a leap of faith, right? Unfortunately, if you listen to the unicorn syndrome, and notice this is also how you know it's a unicorn syndrome. If you listen to the unicorn syndrome, you will take the action that the eating disorder feels comfortable with. That's also a good indicator of why you should not listen to the unicorn syndrome, right? Anything that makes you take the eating disordered action is not really worth listening to. So in the case of the unicorn syndrome, when you're experiencing rapid weight gain and early recovery, you would think, well, I'm permanently broken my entire body and metabolism, never going to work, never going to repair, so I'm going to restrict because I need to, make sure I'm not gaining weight into infinity and beyond. Because in my case, it's permanent. Because in my case, it's broken. And with the extreme hunger example, that and a typical like unicorn syndrome response could be, well, recovery is not for me. I need to restrict. Or, well, I have to, compensate after my binges, right? Because in my case, it's not really extreme hunger. It's just like me having some kind of moral failure, right? So again, can you see how the unicorn syndrome will just constantly justify incorporating disordered behaviors? And one thing is just being unaware, right? Because there are many people who experience extreme hunger and they actually don't know what it is. And they maybe even have healthcare practitioners who are working with them who don't know what it is either, right? That is not really the unicorn syndrome. That is just you not quite understanding what's going on, and maybe healthcare practitioner don't quite understand what it is. That's one thing, right? The unicorn syndrome is when you know about these things and you still don't believe it applies to you. It is when, if you have a friend who goes through it, you will know exactly what to tell them, what resource to hand them. But when it comes to you, it's just like, not for me though. So yeah, there's a key difference between those two, right? Between a lack of knowledge and knowledge, but the unicorn syndrome. It would be the unicorn syndrome when you have all the knowledge, right? And I think those who listen to my podcast would probably be more likely to fall into the knowledge bracket of things because, I'm not saying that my podcast alone is like, as long as you listen to that, you know everything about recovery. And then if you ever have any doubts or concerns, then it's the unicorn syndrome, right? But I can imagine that the people who listen to my podcast will typically be people who are in recovery, who are actively seeking out information and taking in that information. I can imagine that if you have listened to my podcast, you would know what extreme hunger is. You would know what metabolic suppression is, right? Unless this is your first episode, in which, hi, welcome. Feel free to check out earlier episodes. But anyways, this is something I see a lot when, for instance, when I work with clients. Clients will come to me and they might experience something like extreme hunger. They know what it is. They listen to my podcast episode. They read my stuff on it. They know damn well what it is, often down to a very, down to the nitty gritty of it as well. They are very, very knowledgeable. They often know even more than their doctors or psychologists about some of these things. But why they will come and work with me is because that knowledge in itself, even though it's incredibly helpful, it is not enough for some people. People also want reassurance. And this is something I also hear a lot from clients, they say things like, yeah, I knew what I had to do. I knew kind of the things of it, but I actually wanted to make a plan on how to do it with someone, right? And when I first started coaching, this kind of surprised me because I just expected that was going to be in a situation where I had to kind of explain a lot of the basics of recovery to people. But that's not actually been the case. Most of the time, my clients have a very good awareness of the basics of recovery. But it is that reassurance. It is that, me to say, yes, this applies to you as well. Yes, that is the unicorn syndrome. Yes, let's work together to beat this, right? That's what people seek out. And this is important to say because knowledge in itself can only take you so far, right? And sometimes the eating disorder wants you to just constantly seek out more and more and more knowledge in order to kind of justify recovery, right? And you constantly try and think, oh yeah, but what if? And you just seek out knowledge and you think that, oh yeah, as long as I listen to that podcast episode, read that article, then magically the unicorn syndrome is going to go away and I'm going to feel ready, right? But here's the thing. That's not how the unicorn syndrome works. Yes, it can be helpful towards the unicorn syndrome to do some, psychoeducation, to listen, to read, to learn. That can be helpful. But essentially, per definition, the unicorn syndrome is when you do have that knowledge and you still feel it doesn't apply to you. Because if you don't have the knowledge, it's not the unicorn syndrome. It's just not knowing and being concerned, experiencing things that you don't understand or know what is, right? And that's where I come into the picture, right? Trying to offer the psychoeducation that a lot of people in recovery find helpful. Me personally, when I discovered a lot of the things that I talk about now, it was like a complete game changer for my recovery. But it did not remove my unicorn syndrome. And essentially, the unicorn syndrome does not disappear with more learning. The thing with the learning is that it can give you moments of comfort and clarity, which feels really good, and which is also why I think a lot of people in recovery are very interested in psychoeducation and learning more, because it gives them those moments of almost like a little bit of a hug, give the unicorn syndrome a little bit of a little break in the unicorn syndrome, but it doesn't quite disappear. So how does the unicorn syndrome go away then? What is the solution? I have found and seen when working with people that the solution to the unicorn syndrome is actually just to kind of accept that it's there, call it out for being the unicorn syndrome, and then do what feels wrong. Yes, I said it. You need to act. You can't rationalize your way out of it. You can't. You can try. It's not really going to get you that far. You need to just do it. So let me speak from experience again. So when I was going through my recovery, I also had the unicorn syndrome with my metabolism because I was gaining weight very rapidly in early recovery, despite eating very little, thought my metabolism was broken forever, and of course had all sorts of theories as to why my metabolism would not heal. And it was not like I had to, stop feeling that way to actually recover. No. Instead, I took a leap of faith and I was like, okay, well, I know I feel this way. I know I think these things, but let's just try. Let's just give it a try. And then as I increased my intake and actually noticed that the weight gain did slow down, that was essentially what in my case took away my unicorn syndrome, because now I experienced it myself. I didn't read, I experienced it. So don't necessarily think that having the unicorn syndrome is just something that prevents you from doing anything. It's not, unless you let it. But you have to know that the best way to get rid of the unicorn syndrome is by doing, right? You need to do, because that way you are proving the unicorn syndrome wrong. And the good news is that when you prove the unicorn syndrome wrong with one thing, it gets a lot easier to prove it wrong with another thing as well. So for example, in my case, with my metabolic healing journey, right? So when I started to actually increase my intake, noticed that my metabolism was speeding up, that debunked the part of my unicorn syndrome that was around metabolism. And that also, when I had this fear that I personally will have to hide my sweets forever, I can never fully intuitive eat, because I clearly had no self-control when I was 5 years old and my mom hid the gummy worms in the cupboard, right? So when these thoughts came up, I could think, oh, I was wrong last time. I had beliefs that I was uniquely flawed and couldn't do things other people in recovery could do, right? So I used that experience of thinking that I'm permanently broken with my metabolism to think, oh, if the metabolism part wasn't true, maybe this thing about me being unable to control myself around food, maybe that's also just not true. Maybe that's a myth. Maybe that is the unicorn syndrome, right? And then doing the same thing, having a leap of faith and actually trusting myself to try doing what feels wrong. In short, you cannot necessarily think yourself out of the unicorn syndrome. You can have moments of comfort, for instance, hearing about someone else who thought they were uniquely different and seeing that they weren't, and then they sharing their experience, right? Or things such as listening to this podcast may help you have those moments of comfort of like, yeah, okay, I'm not a unicorn, it's fine. But at the end of the day, you need to also act yourself out of it, because that's when your brain is fully going to realize that, oh, yeah, I was wrong. I think it's such a common trap in recovery community that people fall into this habit of just having to endlessly research and know everything before they can do. But this is also an avoidance behavior. So be aware of how avoidance behaviors come up in recovery, whether that is the unicorn syndrome, whether that is needing to know everything, whether that is waiting for the magical future moment when you're going to feel ready. Spoiler alert, that's not how it works. There is no light bulb moment. The light bulb stays off until you turn it on. Doesn't turn itself on. And equally, you can read for years about light bulbs and become a light bulb expert and know everything about electricity and even have all these conspiracy theories about why your light bulb is not going to turn on when you press it on, right? But you're still eventually going to have to actually press the on button on the light bulb. Is that how light bulbs work? No, that's how lamps work. But you know what I mean, right? So to conclude this episode, the unicorn syndrome is a very, very common thing. You can't necessarily think yourself out of it. You can have moments of comfort, of reassurance through reading and listening to podcasts, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, you do have to act to fully prove to your brain that you are not the unicorn. And be aware of the weak evidence that the unicorn syndrome will come up with. It's very weak evidence. And it's sometimes very creative evidence. Like, I've heard some of the most amazing unicorn syndrome theories. And it's interesting because they make so much sense to the person. But for other people, it's like, oh. And these are the type of things that can be very helpful to discuss with, for instance, if you have a therapist or a coach that works on interrogating limiting beliefs. Especially, for instance, if you're doing something like CBT or, some of these strategies, this is also what I work on, are really a key factor is to investigate beliefs and kind of be like, well, do you have evidence to support that claim? Is this belief helping you or harming you? Is it preventing you from acting, right? But try and think of it this way. How has listening to your eating disorder worked so far? Is your eating disorder usually right or wrong? If you had a friend that was just lying all the time and constantly wrong, why would you trust that friend? And also, would that be a friend? No, it would be an enemy. Anyways, guys, let's move over to a listener question. I know I've said it before, but I'll just remind you again. I take listener questions on Instagram. So my Instagram accounts are at Amalie, AMALIELEE. Ooh, that's a lot of letters. I'm saying it because nobody knows how to spell my name. And also on Instagram at letsrecover.co.uk. So if you have a listener question that you want to submit, keep an eye on the stories because I will put up these ask boxes where I ask people to submit listener questions to my podcast. I find it easier to do that way because then I have all of them at one place, and also because the way stories are formatted, it also means that people ask shorter questions that are more general, which is also helpful for the podcast to kind of keep it short, keep it simple, and keep it in a way that other people listening to podcasts can also maybe benefit from listening. Please be aware that I do tend to get a lot more questions than I can actually answer. So I always try to answer the things that most people ask. So don't be scared of asking, right? If I see 5 people have asked almost the same question, that would be the question that I will prioritize. But also sometimes I will prioritize questions that I just think are really important or something maybe that I haven't spoken about before. So yeah, ask anything really. And this is one of those cases where I'm answering a question that not necessarily a lot of people have asked, but I still think is very important. And this is someone asking how to deal with complex comorbidities such as ADHD, bipolar disorder, schizo. I assume you mean schizoaffective disorder, but some people also use schizo as a shortening for schizophrenia. But in short, how to deal when there are other conditions that are also present in addition to the eating disorder. And the truth is, there is not one short answer to this because it depends on the condition, and it also depends on whether or not, when someone has another mental health condition in addition to an eating disorder, it's very important to see, is this mental health condition secondary or primary? So if something is primary, it means that that is kind of the main thing, it's the thing that's been present first, and that's the main issue, right? And if it's secondary, it's more something that happens as a result to that other condition. So let's use an example, right? A lot of people with eating disorders develop some degree of obsessive compulsive disorder as a result of the eating disorder. Or they might experience depression because the eating disorder is, making them quite isolated and miserable. In these cases, the OCD and the depression would be considered to be secondary conditions, with the eating disorder being primary. Then there are other cases where another condition is the primary one. So for example, someone has schizophrenia, and then as a result of the schizophrenia, they are developing an eating disorder. And of course, it is important to say that it's not always so clear cut. It's sometimes very difficult to see which came first, what's the primary, what's the secondary. But these are the type of things that you will typically work with a mental health practitioner and figuring out. And typically a psychiatrist or a psychologist or someone who works more with, medications, diagnosis, etc., etc. So in terms of how to proceed with treatment when you have, complex comorbidity, it really depends on your type of comorbidity, how much it affects you, how significant of a part it is, and what you seek out in treatment. And every practitioner has a different approach to this. I can just kind of say what I personally do is if I have a client that has a comorbid condition, so let's imagine they, for instance, they have an eating disorder, but they also have quite significant anxiety disorder, right? Or they might, have anything that is also impacting their mental health significantly, I tend to recommend working in a multidisciplinary team. So for example, I might work on the eating disorder, but they might also have a psychologist that work on the, let's say, the anxiety disorder. And they might have a psychiatrist that help with the medications. And then I will actually work as part of this treatment team where I specialize more in targeting the eating disorder and they specialize more in the other things. And of course, this can be complicated at times because these things overlap. For instance, in depression, some people with depression experience appetite loss. But is that appetite loss just depression? Is it the eating disorder as well jumping in here? And that's why working in a multidisciplinary team where you actually communicate with other people involved in the treatment can be very, very helpful. I also personally believe that it is important for us who work with eating disorders to educate ourselves about other things as well. So for instance, I may not be an expert in, let's say, depression, but I do have some training and academic knowledge about it. And I'm always, making sure to research, to listen, to learn about things that my clients might be experiencing in addition to the eating disorder. For example, I'm currently reading and learning more about trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and also what is called CPTSD, so basically complex PTSD, etc., etc. And that's because I know that by being trauma informed, even though I wouldn't say that I'm, capable of treating trauma per se, I don't feel like that's something I'm qualified to, I can keep that in mind when treating the eating disorder. So essentially being trauma informed is very helpful. And I think this is just something that goes with so many things. I think that being aware of how, for instance, if you have a client that has, let's say, ADHD, very helpful to know a bit about that so you can offer a better service to your client. You may know that, that this is maybe a client who have tendency to maybe lose track of time, maybe forget a meal. Maybe we should use a specific approach, right? So yeah, I know this is not like an official answer because this is just more my approach. Me personally, if I have a client with a comorbidity that's quite significant, I tend to say, hey, okay, of course, I love to help you in your recovery, but I also think that we need more people in with expertise that I don't have. Then again, there are people with comorbidities that they might feel like even though it's significant, it doesn't really tie that much into their recovery and they don't really need someone to work on with that. Or they might have a comorbidity that they know is directly tied into the eating disorder and that with recovery it would actually improve. And also there are some practitioners that do have knowledge and skills in different things than just the eating disorder, right? So for instance, ADHD, I would like to say that I do have quite a bit of skills in working with that as well and around that. I'm not an ADHD practitioner, but I come from it more with a lived experience as someone diagnosed with ADD. Someone also works with clients who have ADD, ADHD. So it absolutely is possible to take a more of a holistic approach, right? But I do think that even though us as mental health practitioners are capable of taking a holistic approach, I do also think it is very important that we know our limitations and we know when to get more people onto the team. And I also think if you're working with practitioners who are just completely hesitant towards working with other people as part of a team and kind of look to, isolate you from your treatment or support team, that is a red flag, honestly. Unfortunately, I see this with some coaches and therapists, and I don't think it's okay at all. Unless, of course, the treatment that you're getting is just completely awful. Like, that's one thing, right? I just think the world would be a better place, or the world of eating disorder would be a better place if more practitioners were able to come together and collaborate. I've had amazing results collaborating with other practitioners. I think my experience has been good, but I also know that for some people it can become almost like an ego battle of like who's wrong, who's right, and that's not helpful either, right? So have a treatment team that can actually work together. That is so important. And make sure that people in this team actually communicate so that you don't get conflicting advice and actually, you don't have one person saying this and one person saying that, because that can be quite confusing. So in short, do you need a multidisciplinary team when you have a comorbid condition? I would say it depends. It depends on the extent where that comorbid condition is affecting you, and also whether or not it is related to the eating disorder. And sometimes even if it is related to the eating disorder, actually getting some support from that could be helpful. So for instance, you may have depression because, living with an eating disorder kind of sucks, right? And that can make you quite depressed and isolated. And it's still, even though it is the result of the eating disorder, it may still be helpful to talk to maybe a psychiatrist or a psychologist and look and see if there is any particular things, maybe medication, etc., that you think could help you. Whilst in other cases, you may notice that the depression, actually, you didn't really feel like you needed specific treatment for the depression. You felt like the depression kind of lessened as you recovered and got your life back, right? So it really, really depends. I would say the best thing you can do if you are someone with comorbid condition is to have these conversations with the people that are treating you, that are helping you and supporting you. And also if you are looking to, maybe looking to get a coach or a therapist, have these conversations with them. Talk with them. What are their training? Do they have any specific knowledge about whatever condition you are struggling with? And also, are they willing to work in a team? And also communicate with them how your condition affects you, right? This can also sometimes be very, overlooked. For instance, imagine if you're someone who has ADHD and you're going for eating disorder recovery coaching. It could be very helpful to let your coach know that, so that you can maybe see if there's any specific tools that could be applied and how that can make things easier. Because healthcare practitioners aren't always mind readers, and also even if they are really well trained, they don't always know everything. They don't always know exactly how a specific condition would play out in your case. So keep communication open. Eating disorder recovery is fully possible also with comorbidities. I say this as someone who have comorbidities in addition to having had an eating disorder, and also someone who worked with people with comorbidities. It is absolutely possible. It is not like, oh yeah, because I have ADHD, I can't recover from eating disorder, because then normal rules of recovery don't apply to me, right? This is a little bit like unicorn syndrome, probably a little bit better argument, but still wouldn't hold up in court, right? But you can be aware of how your comorbidity may complicate or affect your recovery, and then work with that. And work with people who understand that and are able to see that and apply that in your recovery. It's so interesting because comorbid conditions, they are always assumed that they have to strongly affect eating disorder, but there are cases where they don't really do that much. So for instance, with me as someone with ADHD, ADD, I didn't really find that it affected me that much in my eating disorder or recovery. But I know for some people with that condition, they say that it really does. Overall, it's a very interesting and important subject that I will definitely talk more about in the future, about, comorbid conditions, how they affect an eating disorder, secondary versus primary conditions, and dealing with complex cases. But just don't confuse complex with impossible, and don't confuse complex with unicorn. There are complex horses as well, right? Still horses. And I would actually say that comorbidities is very common. It's not uncommon. It's actually very, very common. But of course, some comorbidities are more common than others, and some are more complex than others. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please, rate the episode, share it whatsoever. Really, really appreciated. And yeah, I look forward to talking with you guys next week.